everyone, I'm your midwife, Tanya Tringali. Welcome to the Motherwit Podcast, a show about the issues we healthcare consumers and providers face every day as we interact with the medical system. We'll talk about its blind spots, shortcomings, and share strategies we can use to feel seen and heard, no matter which side of the table we sit on. My guest today is Hali Shields. We met back in November at a terrific conference for lactation professionals called Lactation. I will share information about this in our show notes because I want more people to know about this. This conference is really special. It's put on by a friend of mine, actually, and a friend that some of you listeners might know, Dana Hilsenrath. You might know her from Thriving After Birth because she's one of the lactation consultants that comes into that course with me. Anyway, it was fantastic. So I want to make sure people know about that for the future. So Hali and I connected and exchanged a number of emails and realized we had a ton in common. So here we are. Let me tell you a little bit about her, and then I'll tell you the plan for today's episode, which is called Moving Beyond the Breastfeeding Basics. Hali is an international board-certified lactation consultant. She's a doula, a health and wellness coach. She teaches yoga, pre- and postnatal barre. She has certifications in Reiki and massage. She does so many things. She brings a whole person approach to the care she provides, which I love, and it's so much of what I do, so that's really where we connected. She includes functional nutrition, postpartum physical and mental health, stress reduction, nutrition. She kind of brings it all in under this huge umbrella that she has to play with. She helps new parents build confidence in this often challenging but transformative time. So, because Hali uses so many modalities, as I just described, and takes such a holistic approach, I asked her to join us today so that we could take a deeper dive into a few subjects that I feel, and I think she agrees, that if all you ever took was a straightforward childbirth ed class, maybe you got an hour of breastfeeding education, and things were touched on in a very particular way. I think she and I are both very clear about what was likely included in that. And we really want to take a little bit of a deeper dive into a few topics that we feel like expanding upon could be really helpful. So whether you are a pregnant person or a newly postpartum person listening and you kind of realize that there was more that you needed, or you're a healthcare provider and you're trying to figure out how to fill those gaps and remind yourself what people are getting and what they're not, this might help you kind of beef up the talk that you give to people on a regular basis. To be a little more precise, we are going to look at three main areas. We're going to talk a little bit more about nutrition and how nutrition can affect our milk supply when we're breastfeeding. We're going to talk a little bit about mental health when breastfeeding. And then we're going to talk about the lack of postpartum preparation that I think most people feel, right? We get so focused on preparing for pregnancy. It's something we talk about on this show all the time. And we kind of find ourselves up against the wire and we really haven't prepared for postpartum. So that was a very long-winded intro into what I hope will be a very insightful episode. Hali, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really happy to have you. As I've said, I think when we met, we realized that we had a lot of things in common because we approach our clients in probably similar but also very unique ways. And I think the ways that we approach people really sets us apart from a lot of other people, in that I don't know too many people who have as many and varied interests as you have, which reminds me of myself. Because oftentimes I feel like, oh my gosh, I'm wearing too many hats and no one can be jack of all trades, right? And I don't know how you feel about all that, but I would love for you to tell us about yourself, but also kind of tell us how you got here and how it is and why it is that you ended up diving into so many different modalities and tools and ways of caring for people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we do have a lot of similarities in the way that we approach caring for people, and I just have so much interest, so many interest that I get excited about so many different facets. My mom is always joking. She's like, are you a public notary? Like, do you have that certification? Do you have this certification? And, I'm I want to be able to help people very holistically. So that's kind of why I've gotten certified in so many different areas. So it kind of starts out with my mom she was a NICU nurse for over 30 years. And I used to go into work with her and I would get to see the little babies. I have a younger sister who's 12 years younger than me, and I attended her birth. And that's kind of where my passion for supporting people during this time really took hold. When I graduated from college, I was like, what am I going to do? And I thought about becoming a midwife because I was so mesmerized by the process of birth. So I really dove in head first and was like, let me try to start with doula work and see how I like it. So I started working as a birth doula. And from there, the passion only grew. And I took multiple certifications to be able to support people from that holistic lens. Kind of going back to kind of where I found more of a functional approach is because I was suffering from some very challenging health concerns myself. And so that's kind of where I found functional medicine and working with these providers that had a lot of different varied credentials that I found the most relief. And I was like, well, if it works for me, it's going to work for other people too. But after I attended about 150 births, I realized, you know what? There's just so little support in the postpartum period. There's a lot of support in pregnancy. There's a lot of support around the birth time, but postpartum, not so much. So I've, since then have gotten my IBCLC and have been primarily focused working as a lactation consultant. I'm also a national board certified health and wellness coach, have 3 different credentials in nutrition, like you said, reiki, massage. I've been trained in postpartum mental health, got a lot of different things under my belt because that's how people are. We are a very holistic being and we can't just focus on one area without looking over the entirety of, someone's life.
Yeah. And when we're caring for people, at least for me, all these different pieces that I love so much, I think I feel more prepared when I know I can reach into my bag and pull out another trick, right?
Absolutely.
I think that probably is what drives most people, whether people learn in the form of taking a continuing education course or a weekend seminar, or it is some bigger, larger certification that's more time consuming or more expensive, whatever. There's so many different ways we can learn. It can be formal, it can be informal. But I think for those of us who care for people, you quickly realize that every situation you walk into, you are more likely to experience something that you aren't familiar with or don't feel adept in yet for a very long time. And so you kind of have no choice but to continue to grow this massive toolkit in order to find yourself feeling competent and confident in each client interaction. Does that resonate?
Absolutely. Yes. 100%.
So I think that's what happened to both of us and probably a lot of our listeners. Okay. Are you pregnant or a new parent looking to ensure a better postpartum experience? Or are you a birth worker looking to improve your postpartum care skills? Check out Thriving After Birth, an online self-paced course by me, midwife and educator Tanya Tringali. It's 10.5 hours of video content featuring experts in lactation, mental health, pelvic floor health, pediatric sleep issues. You also get worksheets and a workbook, as well as options to have a one-on-one session with me. Sign up at motherwitmaternity.com/thriving and let's improve postpartum care together. So let's take this piece by piece, and I think the real challenge for you and me is going to be tying it up with a bow and saying we can't do it all, but just kind of opening the door to people's understanding that there's so much more to each of these topics, and maybe we'll leave them with some resources if they find themselves feeling like, I think they're onto something that really resonates with me and I'm going to need more of that. So we'll make sure that we don't just leave you hanging, that we send you away feeling like you know how to get more content on something if you need it. But we're going to start by talking about nutrition. And when I say nutrition, I mean we're talking about nutrition for the lactating individual and how that can have a huge impact on the success of your breastfeeding journey. So I think everyone knows, or we're going to assume, we're going to start from the assumption that people understand the basics of supply and demand. You got to use the milk to make the milk. Let's leave it really simple. I'll let Hali add to that if she feels like there's just one or two sentences that really need to be said to flesh this out before we build on that. But the real take home here is let's talk about how you can beef up your nutrition to bolster your supply and have a better experience. What do you want to add right off the bat to just that basic understanding of supply and demand to make sure that all our listeners are on the same page?
No, I think you've got it. I think that's the starting point, and that's what is taught, is that supply and demand process. There's a lot of course, moving parts to that, a good latch, good positioning, things that we need to really focus on, but it really comes down to the removal of the milk to create more milk.
Good. I love that you added that because, again, our idea here is that everyone has learned something about supply and demand, and in doing so, they probably learned some tools for a good latch and good positions and whatnot. So I think you really did flesh out what it is that we meant by you know something about supply and demand already. Okay, so with that being the baseline for where we're starting from, Hali, what do you think are the most critical components that we can easily impart on people that could make a huge difference in their experience?
Yeah, so when it comes to nutrition, I mean, we're taught like nutrition is everything. When I see these parents in the hospital, a lot of times on the second day, when they start getting really worried that they have low milk supply, my first question is always, have you had anything to drink? Have you had any food? Because that is super important. Of course, when are you latching the baby? How's the baby latching? You know, we've got to focus on those areas as well. But I always want to make sure that that person is taking care of themselves, because if they're not, that is going to impact their milk supply. So nutrition is one of those things that everybody's body needs something different, and there's no one size fits all approach for anybody, because what works for you doesn't work for me, and that's just, you know, how we are. But I always like to share with new parents, make sure you're eating, make sure you're staying hydrated, because I think when we become a new parent, we forget these things. We want to take care of the baby, and we got to make sure the baby's fed and the baby's diaper's clean, and all these things add up. But we want to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. And that really just comes down to simplicity of making sure you're hydrated. You know, I always check on like the electrolytes, you know, that's a really big piece. So things like coconut water, not a huge fan of, you know, sports drinks and things, but sometimes just adding a little bit of Himalayan salt and fresh squeeze of lemon can be really helpful, just to kind of boost those electrolytes, because we lose a lot when we give birth. And then making sure you're eating like really good quality meals, not just snacking, because a lot of new parents will just kind of grab like a protein bar and that's all they're going to eat for the day, which is not really enough nutrition to help keep you stable, help regulate your blood sugar, help your recovery, help your body make milk. So we want to start off with a really good quality breakfast, you know, something that is nice in protein and it's very balanced. We want to, you know, have a good quality breakfast, like, you know, not just one egg. You know, it needs to be, if we're going to have eggs, we need to have eggs and a piece of toast with maybe some avocado and some sausage or sauteed, you know, greens, something that's going to be a very balanced, nutrient dense. That's what I like to focus on, is a lot of nutrient density. Let's say you like oatmeal or you like yogurt, add in chia seeds, walnuts, fruit, make those foods that you're already eating more nutrient dense, so it gives you the energy to sustain throughout the day. So that's kind of where I start, is starting with a good quality breakfast, then moving to lunch, dinner, and then adding in those snacks as you need to really help to balance it all out.
Yeah, I think one area where people struggle is, well, people largely don't know where to begin with good nutrition, but that's kind of opening a huge can of worms. To narrow down what I'm thinking here a little bit more precisely, I think that people are getting a mixed message. On one hand, there is, kind of the word around town that you do need more calories to make milk. But at the same time, they're bombarded with these messages about losing all this, quote, baby weight. And they're feeling so conflicted about that because they don't really know where they stand. Most people don't know how many calories they're taking in before pregnancy, during pregnancy, let alone after. So when we throw things out to people, which can be helpful for a minority of people, like, oh, when you're breastfeeding, you need an additional 300 to 500 calories a day. Okay, that's great and fine. But unless we really quantify what that amount looks like and whether you're the 300 or you're the 500 based on where you started, these numbers don't mean anything. So people don't know where to go. So on one hand, they're like, I know I need to eat more. On the other hand, they're like, I know I need to lose this baby weight, right? So what I feel like I want people to be thinking about is shutting down that message about society and losing weight for at least 6 weeks. I'm not saying I ever want people to think that way, but like just baby steps here. I want people to say, nutritious food, don't worry about the calories unless you're one of the minority who knew a lot about their nutrition beforehand. If they were somebody who perhaps was already counting their macros before, modified them for pregnancy, and they're prepared to modify them for postpartum. Unless that is you, don't start thinking about numbers because you weren't thinking about them before, so now they don't matter. That's kind of one of the big takeaways I have. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely true. I mean, there's such this push to lose the baby weight right away, and we have to take one step at a time. It takes 9 months to grow a baby. Don't expect to, be back to what you look like before in a very short duration. But in terms of macros, like, yes, I have had clients that were doing that previously, and that's fine. If you already know and that's what you were doing before, you have a better idea of knowing like how much you're taking in. But counting calories is just adds more stress. We shouldn't be doing that in the postpartum phase. I mean, really at all, but especially not postpartum, because you don't need an additional layer of something to think about. That's why I just say add more nutrient density to your food. Just throw in, some more walnuts or mixed nuts and things, and that's what's going to get you to that 300 to 500 calories extra a day.
Yeah, I think people can focus their mind on, is there a protein on my plate? Is there a healthy fat on my plate? And is my plate colorful? Because by just talking about it being colorful, we're talking about vegetables without even having to say that word, right? Because nothing else is colorful except fruits and vegetables. So colorful, is there a healthy fat? Is there a protein? That's probably enough information. But since I went ahead and quantified the calories, I just want to throw out this number in case anybody cares about protein. Because if anyone was going to count anything, I think understanding, very briefly, this is not like an everyday, forevermore thing, but understanding how much protein you're actually taking in can be really helpful. And it's the easiest thing to count. You look at, the piece of chicken or whatever, and you can kind of do some guesstimating. I don't even care if it's accurate. I think most people have heard, whether they remember or not, that the palm of their hand, something that's about the thickness of your hand, that's usually about a 4-ounce piece of meat, right? So if it's a chicken breast or whatever it is, you can kind of do some guesstimating. If you're eating a protein bar, it says it on the package what it is. So you can kind of like figure out, am I getting enough protein? So the average person who's in any sort of a mode of healing, whether it's illness, it's postpartum, it's wound healing, it's whatever, needs somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 grams per kilogram, which is super confusing to us Americans because we don't think that way. But to make it really simple, a 150-pound person needs about 100 grams of protein. So for just a day or two of your life, especially if you're pregnant right now and not yet postpartum, like just take a stab at figuring out how much you're getting. Are you getting closer to 50, or are you breaking that 100 mark, or whatever that number needs to be based on your body weight? Because protein is so important, and people don't know how to get there. They don't know what they're aiming for. So I kind of fall into this weird gray zone where I think some people are irritated with me because I say, I don't want you to think about the numbers, and then I talk about the numbers. But it's because I want everyone, depending on how you think, right? I know that my listeners and my clients tend to be extremely type A, and they're willing to run a short experiment to get this information, right? So again, my message is not do this every day for the rest of your life. It's, oh, I can quickly kind of get a handle on this thing so that I know something about myself. Anyhow.
No, 100%. And I kind of do the same thing. It's like most people don't eat enough protein. And it is super important, especially when we're recovering from something as significant as childbirth. You really need that protein just for your body to recover. So yeah, if you can count that for a day or so, kind of figure out how much you're eating, then that's a good starting point. That's different than counting calories and counting all these things that can be super overwhelming.
Totally. And counting calories is stupid anyway, because
it is.
you could literally eat like just M&Ms and say, well,
Absolutely.
I just ate 2,000 calories of M&Ms
There you go.
and now I'm done eating for the day. Well, that's ridiculous. Nobody would want to do that. But if you did that for a day, you'd realize how freaking hungry you are, and then you would choose different foods.
Yes.
So that's the whole point of running an experiment. I think when people look at the things that are scary as a short-term investment in learning something about themselves, it can take on a different feel. So that's kind of, anyway, I'm beating a dead horse. Any particular thoughts about vegetarians?
I would say I'm conflicted on that because I've been vegetarian most of my life. I'm not a vegetarian anymore. I think that there's definitely ways that you can get those protein needs in if you're vegetarian. So, if you're vegetarian for a certain reason, then, we can work around that. If, you're vegetarian just because it seems like a good thing to do, then maybe we can kind of talk about that and determine like what foods actually work well for your body, and what foods don't, because everybody's chemistry is a little bit different. So yeah, there's ways to get the nutrients in if you're vegetarian. For most women who have, uteruses that are menstruating, vegetarianism is probably not the best, but I also understand the other side because for most of my life, I haven't eaten meat. I've actually never had red meat in my life. So it's hard for me to say, yeah, I've had other things, but not red meat.
I completely agree with you, and I do struggle, and I can see the look on your face that our listeners can't see as you try to unpack this in an unbiased way. But I actually agree with you. I'm somebody who I completely understand the various reasons why people would choose to be a vegetarian, and there are times when I wish I was that person for various reasons. But I just can't make it work and hit the requirements that make me feel my best. And so I get that. And I don't work with too many vegetarians. It happens once in a while. So I beef up on that content when I need to. But it's certainly not my area of expertise. I would say, for the vegetarians out there who are making a real concerted effort, you may need to work with somebody who really gets you and gets your nutritional needs so that you don't feel kind of siloed or isolated in that way. But just very briefly, I would say you're going to need to focus on iron, calcium, B12, and of course protein, which we've already said. And you may need to do that in the form of supplements. And so supplements can be okay for everyone, but I just don't want to see people relying on supplements. I want to see people trying to get these requirements met more or less from their diet. And that is hard in today's society, no doubt, which is where the supplements come in. After you've really put in the effort to do your best, how can supplements, take you a step further? All right, anything else you want to add about nutrition before we move on to our next topic, which is breastfeeding and mental health?
No, I think we covered some good basics. I mean, I think if you are curious, definitely reach out to someone trained in this area to find out what's going to be best for you, because there's so many different areas of nutrition that we can dive into, but it is a very personalized thing. So it's not something that I can broadly explain for each individual person.
Yes, agreed. And to that, I will add, because you reminded me what we hadn't said yet, which is we didn't leave people with resources on this topic. And so I have two in my hands right now, one that is geared more towards pregnant and postpartum people, but is amazing for any healthcare provider, birth worker to have on hand as well. And one that's much more intended for healthcare practitioners, but for really savvy readers who can handle a little bit of a heavier content. The average pregnant or postpartum person might be happy to have this book also. So the first book is called Real Food for Pregnancy by Lily Nichols. It is hands down one of the best books. Haley's nodding at me right now as I say this because everyone in the field knows this book. I can't recommend it enough. I've definitely recommended this on other episodes. So good, so good. The other book, which I've maybe only mentioned a couple times, is called Functional Maternity. And this is by Sarah Thompson. And interestingly enough, the how like other authors of important books will like write something on the cover of other people's books. The little blurb on this one is written by Lily Nichols, who I just mentioned. So they are well matched. Anyway, Functional Maternity definitely speaks more to healthcare providers. It's a little heady. It gets into lab testing, all this stuff. It's very complicated at times, but it is really great in the way that Haley talks about adding in that functional piece to the way we care for people that can take a lot of time to learn, but this is a great resource to have on hand. Okay, I will make sure to put both of those in the show notes for our listeners so that if we piqued your interest on diving a little bit deeper into nutrition and how you can optimize this piece for pregnancy or postpartum, those are the two best go-to references I have for you. Anything you want to add to the reference list?
Those are great.
Hey everyone, it's me, Tanya, your host here at the Mother Wit Podcast. You know I sometimes invite my clients on the show to talk about their birth stories and postpartum experiences, but I want to tell you a little bit more about what those clients and I actually do together. I started MotherWit to help people in the perinatal period achieve their health and wellness goals. That means whether you're hoping to conceive and struggling with high blood pressure or high blood sugar, or you're having trouble managing anxiety or depression in the postpartum period, or maybe you just need support and advocacy between prenatal or postpartum visits, I can help. Get a discount on your first consultation with me at motherwitmaternity.com using the code FIRSTCONSULT 10% off. That's 10% symbol, all one word. I'm looking forward to working with you and maybe having you on the show too. Next topic here is mental health. And there's a reason that people like Haley and myself spend a lot of time talking about mental health because it's kind of like, it's everything. It's everything. And I'm not even quite sure how to open this can of worms and talk about this, but I'm trying to remind myself that our goal today was to stay focused on breastfeeding as it pertained to each of these three areas. So let's just start by kind of maybe brainstorming, mind mapping your thoughts on that intersection between breastfeeding and mental health. And from there, maybe that'll help us kind of unpack for listeners something that's a little more useful.
Breastfeeding's hard. And I think that not enough people actually say that. It's probably one of the hardest things you're going to do for some people, not everybody. Some people can breeze right through it. But I've had moms tell me that, they didn't know that it would feel so lonely, that they didn't realize it was going to be hard, that they went through the whole pregnancy and birthing process and they were like, great, this is easy. And then they get to breastfeeding and frankly just kind of sucks for them, for lack of a better word. And some people can get the support, they've got insurance that covers it, they can afford the support, but some people can't. And that's really where this whole mental piece, I think comes in, is we don't have enough support in this area of maternal health, and that tends to kind of go down the path of, our well-being, our mental well-being. And it's all, like we talked about in the beginning of the call, it's all intertwined. We as humans have a very holistic way about us. We need to be sleeping, we need to be eating, we need to be moving our bodies, we need to be, in a healthy mindset. And when it comes to lactating and feeding your baby, it's stressful, which can lead to really tough challenges in the area of mental health.
Yeah, and in listening to you say that, I was like frantically scribbling notes down so I could just try to keep some thoughts in my head. Two main things came to mind. One is, while I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be teaching people the basics about supply and demand and latch-in positions and all this stuff, I feel like something happens, which is, people come into pregnancy moving towards breastfeeding with this idea that it's a natural process and it's just going to happen and work. But at some point, modern culture has seeped in and people have heard that that's not true. But then you go to the class and you learn all the things and you leave feeling reassured again that, okay, now I know those things. And so now it's just going to work. And then it's still hard, right? And you said it and then you kind of backpedaled a little bit because it sounded harsh. I think what you were saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think what we both see, what many of us see, is that for most people, it's actually very challenging. It doesn't mean it's not going to work out in the end, but it's extremely challenging. And I'm going to say something that's going to be really harsh. It verges on close to impossible when you have no support. I want people to really hear what I just said. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying it's impossible when you have next to or no support. And unfortunately, that is the norm in this country. People have close to no support. A nurse might have checked on them once or twice in a half-hearted way. I'm sorry, nurses, if you're listening to me. But there's a way in which we're all so busy. I can be included in this sometimes when I have laboring patients on the floor that I have to get back to, but I'm trying to do postpartum rounds and I can only give a few minutes of my time. Your baby has to be awake, ready to nurse. There's a lot of barriers that don't have to do with like my attitude or my desire. But you get people who are very busy and who only have a few minutes. And if it doesn't work in those few minutes, you're moving towards giving a bottle. Because guess what? The policy says that your baby needs to eat every 3 hours, whether it comes from the breast or it comes from the bottle. And now we've already pushed you down a path that has made it harder. So I think this is where I'm coming from with like this idea that it's so hard. And I just wanted people to understand a little bit about why we say it's hard. Like it's not just the like hand skill of it being hard. It's all these other variables that get in the way. So that was one thought I had. And then the other thought, and then I'm going to pass it back to you, is I feel like when you talked about how mental health and all the things are so interconnected, it's almost like any one thing that gets off kilter enough throws the rest of the system off. So you mentioned sleep, you mentioned eating, you mentioned, all the general things that I think everybody intuitively or intellectually knows. But no one knows where their tipping point is until they've fallen onto the other side of it, right? So that lack of sleep catches up to you, and now you don't have the patience or the bandwidth to deal with the challenges that have come with the nursing. Do you see what I mean? I know Haley does, but do our listeners see what I mean? Like, it's these moments that you can't know until you're there that are so hard. And if you don't have that huge underbelly of support to have people lift you up and get you up over, it's hard to get there.
Definitely. Couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think part of my job as a lactation consultant is just sitting there and holding their hands. And that's what I do a lot of the times, is we just chat and I provide them the support that they need that maybe they aren't getting from their partner, or maybe they're not getting it from their family, just from society. And it's so needed, especially right now. It is so needed, that support. So, when it comes to the positioning and the latch, and yeah, most people can figure that out, but I think some of the stress that comes from lactation is some people end up in pain, in not knowing how much the baby's getting, in mastitis, in oversupply, in things that, if you're not getting the support, you don't know how to work with it. And there's new research out there now that shows that things like mastitis and oversupply and clogged ducts are actually related to our gut health. And not many people know about that. And I think when we've got these conditions, a lot of people will go to their doctors who are still using the recommendations that were from years ago. And the American Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine comes out with new research all the time, and there's updated research, and I'm still kind of battling that. I still do work part-time in the hospital and working with doctors on, managing certain things that we need to evaluate, things differently. It's not just do this, do that. So that's really where I think breastfeeding can get hard too, is there's a lot of conflicting information out there, and not everybody knows where to turn. It can be very overwhelming, and you've got a baby that needs to latch very frequently and needs to eat quite often, and you're moving from an adult that functions and can, you do things when you want to do them, and now we have this little being that needs you and then is always wanting to go to the breast. And in some ways that's very normal. In some ways it's not. Some babies that want to latch all the time, as I hear, means that maybe there's other things that we need to look at. But that's where you need that support to figure out and fine tune. Is my baby just doing what it needs to do to eat? And babies eat often. They eat all the time. So for some parents, it can really feel like they're constantly feeding the baby, but in most cases, that's very normal.
So you brought up two things I think we should unpack that would really serve our clients and send them away with really tangible skills and tools in this department. I'm actually going to take the second one first because I think it'll lead into the first. I think we should talk with people a little bit about cluster feeding, because you said the thing that I think everyone goes through. It's like, oh my God, my baby's eating all the time, which on one hand, people are hearing, maybe that means my baby's not getting enough. And then they say, oh, how do I know? Right? And that anxiety creeps in. And then on the other hand, they're like, oh, your baby's just cluster feeding. So how can someone make sense out of those two things? Like kind of more like in a timeline sense, because it's not something that we put our finger on in a millisecond. It takes a little bit of time to unpack, but how can someone kind of assess themselves to figure out which side of the equation they're likely sitting on?
Well, I always go back to peas and poops for the baby, making sure that the baby is hydrated enough. A baby that is eating enough is going to, depending on their age, is going to have, I always say, at least 6 peas a day, and ideally at least 1 poop minimum. From a pediatrician's perspective, they might even say less than that, but from a lactation perspective, I want them to be, going multiple times a day. And that's a good starting point. We want them to be gaining weight, which if you are concerned about the baby's waking, you can always make an appointment with the pediatrician or meet with a lactation consultant who can assess that. I'm not big on buying scales or renting scales because it just adds more anxiety to that family. And a lot of the scales that you can get, for a reasonable price are not the best for weighing babies. So just kind of watching your baby's cues. I think we get so hung up on, using an app, which there's an app that I always recommend, but we need to be focusing on the baby and what the baby is doing more so, and how the baby's responding. And is the baby eating, and then there's a wake period, and then the baby sleeps? Is the baby going through a pattern where we're seeing, a wake time and they feed, and then we, get to interact with them, and then they can get into some napping times. And, babies are, they don't follow a schedule is the thing that I'm, trying to get across. Is there's so many schedules out there, and oftentimes I get asked like, well, my baby's doing this and my friend's baby is doing that, and I read online that they need to be doing this specific schedule, and that's just not how humans work. We don't follow by the book because we're human beings, and we beat to the tune of our own drum, or whatever that saying is. But that's kind of where I would approach it. Is if you're not seeing your baby peeing and pooping and awake and sleeping well, then maybe there is something that we need to look at and kind of readdress, that maybe the baby isn't getting enough. But babies are going to go through these cluster feeding periods as they're growing, and it's very normal that they go through these periods often, to where it's going to feel like they're eating all the time. And for a breastfed baby, and really for a bottle-fed baby for that matter, it's normal. It's normal that they need to eat frequently. They're drinking milk, and milk is easily digestible, and they need to, meet the demands of their growing body.
So is it still accurate to say to people, I just want to make sure my science on this is not outdated, that when a baby is appropriately cluster feeding, that will occur for usually something around 48 hours, let's say. So you might have a couple days, but then it should settle back into a more somewhat rhythmic pattern. Is that still accurate and appropriate?
Absolutely. 48 hours, not 48 days, 48 hours. 48, and then usually between 7 to 10 days, sometimes around the 2-week mark, around 4 to 6 weeks, and so on. It's every few weeks, really, is what you're going to see your baby clustering as they're growing.
And this is going to correspond to a growth spurt, right? And so you as the parent, unfortunately, you don't see the growth spurt, right? It's kind of like when I look back at pictures of my now grown-up child, and I'm like, wait a minute, she was a baby, then she was a toddler, then she was a kid, then she was a teenager, and I never saw any of that happening in real time, but it did happen. Your baby is growing by grams or ounces, however you want to look at it, and you can't see that change. But that's what's going on. So I think the stress reducer for me that I find most helpful is reminding people when they feel panicky to give it the 48 hours, let's figure out how we're going to emotionally get you through the next 48 hours. And then if this feels like it's not ending, we need to look at this again and see what's really going on. That's kind of the take home for me.
That's a good point. Yep. Give it 2 days, see how you're doing, see how baby's doing, and then reevaluate.
And then my part 2 to that, which we've already partially answered, which is why I went the order I went, is what are the tools out there? And what we just talked about, I think, is the primary tool. You started touching on one, and I totally agree with your perspective, but I want to make sure that people know that there is a way in which we can unpack this differently so that it doesn't become an obsession. So you talked about a baby being weighed. And what you said was, I don't want people buying scales. 110% couldn't agree more. I've seen this happen, and it's like, it's not good. It's never a good path to go down. That doesn't mean that a pit stop with your pediatrician or your lactation consultant for a weighted feed couldn't be a helpful tool. I would love to hear your perspective on this and when someone should give that a go as a tool.
Yes, good point. Work with your pediatrician or work with a lactation consultant, whether that's in the hospital, whether you can find someone through your insurance to come to you, or go to their clinic. But a weighted feed can be really reassuring, or it can be that eye-opener of like, let's change things up. A weighted feed, and I always like to share that a weighted feed is just one glimpse in time. The way their baby eats at the breast is going to vary throughout the day. For most people, they're going to probably take in more milk in the morning times, less milk in the evenings. So depending on when I do weighted feeds, I always kind of try to remind parents that, hey, it's, 6 o'clock in the afternoon. The baby's probably not going to be eating as much if we were to do this weighted feed at 6 a.m. So it's just something to keep in mind that is, the time of day can really impact weighted feeds, but it gives us kind of a data point to know, here's what the baby's taking in at the breast, and it's a teaching tool to teach parents like what suckles and swallows look like and what a good feeding at the breast looks like, or what it doesn't look like on the flip side. And here's why, and here's how to fix it. So definitely a fan of weighted feeds with the right provider. I don't like to have, I don't like to send parents home with a scale because it just adds another layer of stress. Yep. And it's better to get that support that we kind of have been talking about, versus just kind of feeling like you have to do everything on your own.
Yeah, totally agree. So I'm hoping that these concepts and tools can help people manage some of the feelings that creep up in this time, along with a little bit of the unpacking of the systemic issues that we talked about early in this section. As we wrap up this part, I would love it if you would share the app that you said you do recommend. What's your favorite app that you tell people to use?
I like Nara Baby. It's
how do you spell it? Nara?
Nara, yes. Baby Tracker by Nara. They've changed the name in the app stores, but it's very user friendly. It doesn't have a bunch of pop-ups. It doesn't have a bunch of articles that can be very conflicting for a lot of people. It's just straight to the point. There's even a section for the parents as well, which is great. And you can share it with other people. It's free.
Cool. Love it. Love free. Free apps are good. Okay. So as a final point on mental health that kind of transitions us into our final point of this episode, we've beat around this bush quite a bit. We've talked about lack of support and ultimately a lack of time for birthing people to engage in self-care. I don't think there's a person who's ever had a baby who feels like they have enough time to properly take care of themselves. It's common to hear people say things like, I haven't had a shower in 4 days, right? Like, these are really common types of things you hear people say. And for me, while this piece of the puzzle will never be easy, no matter what, I strongly believe that we end up in a heightened version of this situation because we haven't prepared for postpartum. And when I say prepare for postpartum, this is going to sound a little dramatic, but it's like, I don't know much about sports, and so what I'm saying right now is going to come out like really wonky, but like how I imagine people prepare for football, given the fact that I know that they have all these weird like guides and secret handshakes and things going on that like tell them how they're supposed to play it out, right? It's like we have to have addressed in a theoretical way all the things that could go wrong and have talked about all the ways in which we might approach that situation if it happens to us in order to be even remotely on top of it when that thing happens. So if you wouldn't mind, I would love for you to just ramble a little bit about what you think the main highlights are for people to sit down either with their partner and have a conversation, or perhaps alone with a pen and paper and jot down their thoughts so that they can start the process of preparing. Even if all you're going to do is take one 1 hour chunk, or maybe 3 1 hour chunks, whatever amount of time you can commit to this. How can someone approach this in a way that gets them a baby step further than where they would be otherwise?
So starting with, it doesn't have to be, super well written, but just start jotting down a postpartum plan. How am I going to feed myself? Start there. We started this call with nutrition, and that's super important. So whether it's you're preparing a bunch of freezer meals and you've got things ready to go, or you have a meal train, or you have family and friends bring you meals, how are you going to feed yourself those first couple of weeks? Because that's super important. Talking to your partner about, how you're going to sleep. Are you going to kind of trade off? If you are feeding the baby at the breast, especially in those first few weeks, you are going to have to be feeding the baby at the breast. We have to keep stimulating because the supply and the demand process is what is super important. But can your partner watch the baby for a couple hours span so you can get the sleep that you need? And that's where kind of trading off can help. But focusing on our nutrition, focusing on our sleep, and then focusing on just recovery and knowing that, okay, I'm going to have to take care of the house. I'm going to have to take care of this. I'm going to take care of that. But can I get support elsewhere? Can I have someone come in to support me? Am I going to have to just say, I need to let this go for a little while? What am I going to do to feel like, the other things that I need to take care of are being met? And sometimes it's switching roles and having your partner work through some of those. If you are, the parent that is feeding the baby, because breastfeeding is a lot of work. Those are kind of the starting points. And then just having an open discussion about different things that can come up and how you might want to address those with your partner. Like, how do they feel about breastfeeding, and sharing your thoughts on why giving breast milk is important to you? Or how do you feel about giving formula? Is it something that you want to do and you're okay with? Because there's a lot of, I think a lot of parents, especially when I'm working with them, that when they have to give their baby formula, they feel like they've kind of let me down, and that's not the case. We need to be feeding the baby, but having that discussion with your partner is super important. And just kind of thinking of challenges that might come up that we need to talk about prior. So when you're in it, when you're super sleep deprived, when you're hungry, when you're, when there's a lot of emotions at play, that you've got this plan that you've said, okay, you know what, we've already kind of discussed this. I'm going to implement this plan so I feel better in this area.
Yeah, I hope people just took down like a little pen and paper and took some notes about that, because that was really great. There was so much in there. Wow. Okay. Yeah, my recommendation is, if you were just listening, go back and just jot some of these words down with a little pen and paper so that you have a little frame of reference of the things you want to have a conversation about, or jot some things down about. I won't add much to that because I think it was pretty comprehensive and I don't want to make this overwhelming. But a few things that Hali said that aren't necessarily even things I'm adding, just like a different perspective on it. I feel like we can look at life tasks, the things we think of that have to be done, in a few buckets. We pay for things in the form of time, or we pay for them in terms of money, or we throw them over the edge and we forget about them. Those are basically 3 buckets. And so I want people to sit down and look at all of life's responsibilities. So to make this very simple, we've got things like keeping the house clean, doing the laundry, walking the dog, paying the bills, etc., etc. Jot down all the things you can think of, have your partner do the same, because you're not going to remember things that your partner will, and vice versa. And then put them in one of those buckets. Is this something that has to take up our time? Because some things, there's just no other way, right? Like the dog has to be walked, right? Well, there is another way, and it's one of the other buckets. You can either use your own time to do that, you can pay someone to do it, or you can not do it. But taking the example of the dog, not doing it is not an option. So my point is that with each item, you're going to find that there are things that could go into all 3 buckets, and there are some things that, like, one of the buckets just doesn't even make sense. It's not an option, but it narrows down what's possible. So some things are going to come up, and like time is truly the only bucket, and you know it's something that has to be done. And now you can negotiate who's going to do it and when they're going to do it. But these are conversations that you need to have before. Another conversation to have before is advocating for yourself and for your partner regarding parental leave. If you don't know those details of what's possible in your state, you can't advocate for yourself, you can't get the best possible arrangement for yourself. Okay? So that's another topic that requires going to your place of employment and your state laws and figuring out what's what. And then the last thing I'll say on this is, and this is a little further out because people aren't prepared to think about this, and so I don't want to unpack this too much. I just want to put it on your mental to-do list to revisit, maybe like when you're 3 months postpartum. I want you to be thinking about the health of your relationship, because what happens for so many people is our life becomes revolved around our baby, and we become roommates who are co-parenting, and our relationship falls by the wayside. And I've watched so many people navigate that. And I've watched people do it well, and I've watched people not do it well. And I've been there myself. And if I could go back in time and know things that I didn't know when I was a 20-year-old new mom, not yet a midwife, I would approach that differently. And I've spent half a century thinking a lot about this and helping people navigate that and getting ahead of it. So without going down the rabbit hole of how I do that with my clients, because that's a whole episode in and of itself, I want you to be at least thinking about that and knowing that that needs to be on your radar, because I think it falls way to the bottom of the list. I'm going to leave it there. Haley, is there anything else that you want to add? Did I trigger any thoughts or anything that you want to add to the prep list?
That last point was spot on. Work with your partner. I mean, don't let your relationship fall to the wayside, and allow your partner to share in the responsibilities. That's super important, because I've seen so many parents who are like, no, my partner can't do that. And it's simple things like changing the baby's diaper. Absolutely. Let your partner share in those responsibilities.
Yeah, I think an example I can give to that point is we can get really in our own way. For example, we get in this way of thinking where we think that something that's pretty minor in the big scheme of things has to be done a certain way, and my partner just simply doesn't do it right, so I'm going to always do it. Now you feel resentful, and you think you always have to do it, and quite frankly, it's not true. It's not that big of a deal. So figuring out, kind of like how I talked about the buckets before, figuring out which types of tasks are completely non-negotiable. We have to be on the same page in how we manage this. So that might be vaccines, other breastfeeding, whatever. You can put a bunch of things in a bucket where it's important that you're on the same page. But honestly, how someone approaches a diaper change, unless it's completely unsanitary, just turn away, walk away, go somewhere else. right? If you don't like the way they dress the baby, as long as they're not breaking the baby's arm, walk away. Like, these are not worth the battle. And those are the things that get in the way over and over and over again.
100%. You couldn't have said it better. Yes. Let your partner do it.
All right. Well, I think we unpacked a lot. There's so much more we could say and so many more topics we could touch on. But I think this was a good base of things that kind of all harken back to things that can affect our breastfeeding journey. And if we put a little effort into these things, can make things a little bit easier for people. Hali, thank you so much for taking the time to have this like kind of off the cuff impromptu conversation with me. I know it was kind of all over the place in a certain sense, but I think we found our way back to our original goal as we went through it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Hey listeners, chiming in with a final note. I'm going to share with you Hali's information, which, I normally ask people to do that at the end. I don't know why it escaped me this time. Possibly because I've put together a new page on my website that is now live, and I think I subconsciously knew that Hali was on that page. I now have a page to find lactation consultants. It's still small and growing, so if you're a lactation professional out there in the world and you want to connect with me and be listed, please let me know. I want to make sure we start to have resources available for people all over the country and possibly all over the world. So it's a baby initiative, but you can check it out at motherwhipmaternity.com/lactation, and all of Hali's information is there. But since I have your ear still, Hali is on Instagram at Mother Poppins Miami. So you can tell now she's in Miami. So if you're in South Florida, she is available to you. Her website is motherpoppins.com, and you can also email her at Hali, Hali, at motherpoppins.com. All right, thanks.
We hope you're enjoying the Mother Wit podcast. If you are, please rate us and leave a review in iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to your podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Mother Wit podcast. If any of the issues we discussed today resonate with you or your experience, I'd love to hear from you. Leave me a voicemail at 917-310-0573, or better yet, email me a voice memo at tanya@motherwhipmaternity.com. I really want to hear what worked for you, what didn't work, what support you'd wished you had, how you got through the tough times, how you advocated for yourself, or especially any tips you want to share with our listeners. I want to hear all of it. And if you'd really like to work together, you can get a discount on your first consultation with me at motherwhipmaternity.com using the code FIRSTCONSULT, 10% off. That's 10% symbol, all one word. Okay, that's all. It's wonderful being in community with you all. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.
And remember, listeners, nothing we discuss on this show should ever be considered medical advice. Please speak to your local provider about anything that comes up in this show that resonates with you and your needs and your health care.